Presentation provides information on the impact of the Peninsular War on Mexican independence. From 1492 through 1808, Spain had pretty much unquestioned political control of Spanish American colonies, including Mexico. During this time, a caste system evolved and the culture of New Spain. Peninsulars, they were at the top. They were colonists born in Europe and they had the most power. Criollos, they were next. They were colonists of 100% European descent. They were born in America. Finally, mixed race Creoles, mulattoes, and Africans, most born in America. The Africans were generally slaves who had been emancipated, had less power. In 1808, France and Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain. They removed King Charles, replaced him with Napoleon's brother Joseph. Legitimacy of the rule of New Spain became disputed, and loyalties differed according to caste alignment. Questions about the legitimacy of Spain's government during the Peninsular War provided opportunity for those of lower caste to challenge the status of those above. The Mexican Revolution grew out of opportunity associated with the Peninsular War and Spain's loosened grip in Spanish America. Mexican Revolution would have probably happened eventually, but it was really expedited by the Peninsular War. By the early 1800s, Spain had begun to lose its grip on the American colonies. Bourbon reforms had clashed with the desires for autonomy throughout the colonies of New Spain. Spain's involvement in wars with Great Britain and France caused financial instability across the reign of the crown. During the rule of Charles, also known as Carlos, higher taxes were levied upon New Spain to pay for these wars as Spain faced bankruptcy. This did not go over well in the colonies, especially those of lower status. These taxes led to uprisings against the non-native peninsulars, who generally held positions of authority and were seen as the government. In 1808, France, led by Napoleon, overthrew Spanish government during the Peninsular War. France implemented a new constitution that provided increased liberty to colonists in New Spain. Peninsulars, who were in charge, chose to accept French rule in an effort to retain their authority and status. Creoles and those in the lower caste, although that new constitution provided increased liberty, chose to somewhat reject it and reject those in power and desired to remain loyal to the deposed king. And that was pretty much just a way to reject the Peninsulars. In 1810, Creole priest Miguel Hidalgo y Castillo led a revolt against Spanish rule. It was followed by others and other groups who sought independence. Eventually, colonies across New Spain fell into their own independent rule. When Ferdinand VII took back control of Spain in 1813, he attempted to establish absolute control over the colonies, tried to quash the independent rule, and actually wanted to rule with a strong hand, much like the Bourbons had. The majority of colonial population, led by Creoles of lower caste, refused Spanish control and eventually created independent nations, including Mexico in 1821. Let's take a look now at a historiography of the Peninsular War impact on Mexican independence, beginning with some ideas about enlightenment. Anthony McFarland connects the rise of dominant colonial political dissents to beliefs founded in 18th century Enlightenment and 19th century destabilization in Spain. What McFarland is saying is that the Enlightenment movement caused a lot of people in Spain and in the colonies to look towards their independence and their individual liberties that they felt they were due. McFarlane associates the quest for this new identity with unrest created during the Peninsular War, as in New Spain, the insurgents who fought off the royalist government during the decade after 1810 tried to rally Mexicans to a common cause of independence. In From Colony to Nation, from Latin American Research number 43, Rebecca Earle actually states some things outside the provenance of the Peninsular War impact. Earl states that the revolutionary process in America was prompted by a specifically liberal vision rather than just the political unrest due to the Peninsular War. Earl states that independence was the culmination of a process initially started by the conquistadors themselves. And in so saying, she's basically stating that independence was likely to happen. It was in the blood of these people to fight, to be in power. Um, and along with the thesis of this presentation, uh, it was just expedited by the Peninsular War. In Ben Vinson III's book, The Frontiers of Race and Caste in Colonial Mexico, he explains that caste was a socio-economic system of extreme castes and generally labeled castas that existed throughout Spanish colonial society. Hierarchy and status were based on racial mix and skin color, with casta almost synonymous with racial mixture. So basically, the darker your skin, the lower of your caste. By the early 19th century, many of the American Spanish, those of lower status, looked toward a caste flattening period where greater mobility could occur and caste pluralism would become predominant. There would be more equality. When Spanish American rule was disrupted during the Napoleonic Wars, also referred to as the Peninsular Wars, Spanish America's colonial authorities were at times administering a realm of regulated unregulation. I know that doesn't quite make sense. Um, that term is basically saying that they were regulating chaos. There was no real regulation. The resulting pluralism loosened caste enough to help it serve as a credible precursor to mestizaje and the fundamentals of increased status for those of mixed race. In the first America, the Spanish monarchy, Creole patriots, and the liberal state from 1492 to 1867, D.A. Braden argues the revolution was a result of unrest that grew after France overthrew Carlos and Napoleon seated his brother to rule Spain. Braden states that European Spaniards believed the way to continue status was to be loyal to the new ruling party in Spain. So the Peninsulars wanted to implement whatever rule the French were providing them. American Spaniards, the lower status caste people, the Creoles, the mulattoes, believed loyalty should either remain with the deposed crown, and that was basically to reject the Peninsulars, or move to a status independent of European control, basically set up their own governments. Braden states that in New Spain, the first reaction of both officials and the Creole nobility to news of the French invasion of the peninsula was to denounce the imposition of Joseph Bonaparte and warmly acclaim Ferdinand VII as king. The Mexico City Council, a Creole bastion, invoked the standard natural law doctrines of Pufendorf and Heineckes, as provided by their Spanish disciple, Joaquin Marin Mendoza, to affirm that the crown's authority was based upon a primordial pact in which the people irrevocably ceded sovereignty to the king and his heirs. So if the king and his heirs were not aligned with Spain, these people still felt they should be loyal to him. Many American Spaniards believed that with the abdication of the Bourbon monarchs, that would be the deposed Carlos, sovereignty now returned to the people, which was to say the city council that represented the people. The courts of New Spain found otherwise and favored the continuance of European rule. Revolution eventually occurred, as in September 1810, Miguel Hidalgo y Castillo led a rebellion joined by Indians and castes, by the farm laborers, artisans, and miners of the Bayo. Basically, the lower caste rose up against the Peninsulars and rose up against the continuance of European rule. In Spaniards in the Colonial Empire, Creoles versus Peninsulars, Mark A. Burkhalter notes there were 30,000 to 40,000 Peninsulars in Spanish America. They were heavily outnumbered by some 2 million Creoles in the total population of 12 to 13 million. That still leaves another nearly 10 million people, which were of lower caste. The dominant numbers of the lower caste, the native sons, took advantage to eventually revolt and expel the peninsular inhabitants of the colonies. Eric Van Young asserts the advent of the political crisis of 1801 through 1810 eventually led to agrarian conflict. These rebellions act to destabilize Spanish rule and fuel further resistance to a nation destabilized by war in the Iberian Peninsula. The Hidalgo y Castillo insurrection led to the final rupture between European and American Spaniards, as peninsular Spaniards were murdered, and he decreed the abolition of tribute for Indians and mulattoes. Basically, the people of lower caste rose up when they had opportunity. When they had opportunity for independence, they revolted, they chose to find independence, and they chose to overthrow the peninsular Spaniards. Summary and conclusion. Basically, Spain's ability to govern its American colonies decreased during government destabilized during the Peninsular War. The overthrow of the Spanish crown by the French created a huge variety of instabilities. And even though the French tried to implement a constitution that provided increased liberty, those of lower caste rejected it, basically so they could tell the peninsulars to stick it and start a new government. Spanish rule began to be questioned and seen as illegitimate in New Spain. Power struggles along the lines of caste loyalty created indecision in how colonies would be ruled. Old Crown, New French Spanish, or independence. When Spain attempted to reestablish with more authority, revolution occurred pretty much throughout the colonies and led to independence for Mexico. This information was based on a variety of sources, as was stated: D.A. Brading, Mark Burkholter, Rebecca Earl, Anthony McFarlane, and Ben Vinson III. Also, Eric Van Young. A lot of the general information came from John Charles Chastain in his excellent history, Born in Blood and Fire, A Concise History of Latin America.